All right, so greetings everyone. Welcome to the 28th edition of the Educational Leadership Forum focused on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. We deeply appreciate your presence and participation in this distinguished global lecture on social learning and AI. So thank you so much for joining in. My name is Aryan Salman. I'm pleased to welcome our distinguished expert, Professor Dr. Conrad Hughes. Dr. Hughes is Director General of the International School of Geneva and a professor in practice at the University of Durham's School of Education. He is also a UNESCO IB Senior Fellow and a member of the Advisory Board for the University of People. He's a prolific writer who has authored several influential books, including Education and Elitism, Changes and Opportunities for Routledge in 2021. He has also authored Educating for the 21st Century, Seven Global Challenges for Brill Publishers in 2018, and Understanding Prejudice and Education, the Challenges for Future Generations for Routledge Publishers in 2017. His latest book, Changing Assessments, How to Design Curriculum for Human Flourishing, is set to launch in May 2025, offering fresh insights into rethinking assessments and education for a better future. A very warm welcome, Conrad. And for those of you who are new to the Educational Leadership Forum, the Educational Leadership Forum was started with a mission to provide a platform for education leaders to shape, enable, influence, and advance the discourse on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. Our goal today is to create a space where experts, practitioners, and education leaders from across the globe can come together and share their insights, knowledge, and best practices to achieve our core mandate of transforming education. So we are very thrilled and excited to experience this distinguished global lecture on social learning and AI, and are hopeful that you take away with you key ideas and insights to create impactful educational practice. So a very warm welcome once again, Rob, and I yield the floor to you.
Thank you, Ariane, and thank you to everybody for joining. I'll be talking about generative artificial intelligence and critical thinking. The emphasis is going to be on critical thinking with a view to getting us to this space of social learning. There'll be a presentation that I'll be showing as I speak, and I'll be able to take some questions at the end. So let me share my presentation and we'll get right into it. Can you see that?
Yes, I think it's loading.
Okay.
We could see a brick.
Okay, it's interesting because I can't see it, but if you can see it, I can. And Ariane, just come in if there's a problem. So yeah, I'm starting at the brick, and it's a question, and you can maybe put some comments in the chat if you like. But you might have heard of this question, but the question is quite simple. It's how many different things could you do with a brick? How many different things could you do with a brick? And then you have to think, okay, I could build a wall. I could use it as a weapon. I could use it as a weight to pin something down. I could use it to keep a door open. And in order to expand your thinking further, you need to start modifying the brick. If you break the brick into little pieces, the different things you can do with it. If you were to imagine that you could expand the brick or shrink it, you could do even more. If you turn the brick on one side or the other, you could conceptualize, you could ideate, you could think of more purposes. Now, I'm going to start with that brick and end with the brick because essentially this is a question about creativity. Torrance came up with the creativity test in the 1970s. We still use it today, which is testing divergent thinking. So you've got convergent thinking, which is really thinking precisely about a data point. It's going into a lot of detail. It's thinking logically and really in depth. And then you've got divergent thinking, which is thinking out the box, which is spreading your thinking, which is being much more creative. And as we get into generative artificial intelligence, and as we get into critical thinking, okay, I'm going to start with critical thinking and then go into AI. What I'm going to push us to do is to broaden our thinking about both of them, and not just to be caught up with the first and rather narrow assumptions that we might have. That's really core to this talk. So it's on critical thinking and generative artificial intelligence. And at the basis of this talk is this paper that I wrote with UNESCO not that long ago. So if you Google this, or if you look it up, if you're writing critical thinking and generative artificial intelligence, Conrad Hughes into Google, you'll find it quite easily. It's very much the basis of this talk, and will help you navigate what I'm going to say. There's another article I wrote with UNESCO's IBE, Technology and Education, the Double-Edged Sword. This is a couple of years old now, but it's this idea that, you know, technology is something that can be used for ill or for good. And I'll be going back to our own school generative artificial intelligence policy. We've drawn up an AI policy, and all schools need to do this, because if we're operating in an environment where generative artificial intelligence is really sweeping over much of what we discuss, generate, find, and analyze in terms of knowledge, the generation and the distribution of knowledge, then this whole question of what's done in schools, how, when, and by whom becomes really important. Ariane, are things okay with the slides? You can see everything? And the team can see?
Yes.
I saw you put a question out there. So right now we're on generative artificial intelligence. Okay, good. Well, I won't ask you anymore. I'll just keep going then. There's another interesting resource that you can use, and it's part of the Education 2030 suite from UNESCO. It was published around about the time that, you know, ChatGPT was making inroads into our collective understanding of important technological advances. It's guidance for generative AI in education and research. We use this to inform our policy, and I would certainly advise anyone on this call interested in looking at how we can use Gen AI in education, and what some of the guardrails are, the precautions we need to take, as well as the affordances to go to this document. Ariane was mentioning some of my books. This was one of my earlier books. It was my my doctoral thesis in education. It's on education and prejudice, and I go into critical thinking a lot. So that's another source that's influenced this talk. What we're going to look at is critical thinking, then generative artificial intelligence, some of the implications and recommendations. The focus on critical thinking is because it's really, I think, a core expression of social learning. Social learning is learning with other people. And the kinds of discussions that you have, the way that you look at the world, has to be informed by some kind of criticality, I would suggest. So that's really going to be the focus. So first of all, what is critical thinking? What is critical thinking? And from a Western European perspective, which is not the only perspective we should take, and I think we have to situate it as one way of looking at things and not the only way. We like to say that it starts in round about 5th century before the Common Era in Athens, in Greece, where philosophers brought to the fore essentially a new way of thinking about the world and about knowledge. Now, was it really new? Were they really the first to have done it? Almost definitely not. That would be a whole other talk on how to situate the origins of critical thinking, and if it's even necessary to think that there's an origin of critical thinking or of any other trend in human thought. But this is an easy place to start. That image is of the Agora. The Agora, which is a wonderful building if you go to Athens, was where you had the sophists roaming and teaching young people how to make speeches. Okay, Gorgias, the sage, who was seen as a kind of monument of sophistry. It's one of the philosophers that comes to mind. Another is Protagoras. You've got a quotation of his there, man is the measure of all things. Gorgias was a nihilist, and in a way so was Protagoras. A nihilist means you believe in nothing. Now, why do we start here? Because this is a very prominent strand of thought at the time. And if we say man is the measure of all things, the idea is that everything is relative, nothing is absolute. It all depends on who you are, how you're looking at things, what you wish to get out of things. That relativist doctrine is a staple of sophistry. And nihilism is this idea that there's no absolute, transcendent, overarching truth, that you make up truth according to what you need. So that was the dominant thought at the time, and it was in that context of sophistry that critical thinking begins. This is not yet critical thinking. In fact, in a way, it's the opposite. So sophistry, which is at the root of a word like sophistication, means to essentially dazzle your audience, to spin a yarn, to create some sort of belief in whatever it is you're saying, by using rhetoric, by using clever tricks, by using imagery. So that what happened is the sophists made a lot of money in the Agora of Athens, training the children of noble men. It's essentially men at the time, of course, because Athens wasn't very democratic. Women weren't allowed to vote, nor were outsiders. And the idea is that these spin doctors, okay, would be hired to teach the children of patricians how to become politicians, how to make people believe whatever it is they wanted them to believe, how to persuade, the art of persuasion. So Gorgias, Protagoras, and the others are sophists practicing this philosophy in Athens. Now, along comes Socrates. You can see on the slide, you've got Socrates. And Socrates was from that background of sophistry. So he'd grown up with this tradition of speech making, of spinning a yarn, of trying to influence people, as so many politicians do today. I mean, that's, you know, you're trying to get people to vote for you. You're trying to be popular. Don't forget, Athens is a democracy. And he revolted against this. Okay, he didn't like it, and he made himself very unpopular because of that. Socrates was called the gadfly, which is essentially a horsefly, because he would buzz around people and irritate them. He was there in a kind of agent provocateur mode. He was also called the torpedo fish. He's referred to as the torpedo fish. And the torpedo fish is a little bit like a stingray. If you stand on it, it gives you an electric shock and it numbs you. So he was quite aggressive in his whole demeanor. He'd actually fought in the Spartan Wars. He was a stonemason. They said he was very ugly and kind of quite sort of eccentric. Of course, all we know about Socrates is written by Plato and Xenophanes, who was a Greek historian. Most of Socrates is reinvented in Plato's writing. Anyway, so Plato is this sort of irritating, difficult guy who shows up. And what he does is he invents something called the elenchus. So the elenchus, which is also called the Socratic method, it's about asking questions over and over again, to the point where your interlocutor, the person with whom you're speaking, the person who's answering these questions, can't really answer them anymore, because the goal is to show that they don't really know what they're talking about. So if we go back to sophistry, I'm trying to persuade an audience. I'm spinning up all these arguments. If someone comes and starts questioning me on what I'm saying, pretty soon they're going to be able to show me up. You still got that tradition if you look at democracies today, in things like press conferences, where politicians or even leaders of state will be asked difficult questions by journalists. The whole idea of sort of freedom of the press is very much accessed on this criticality, where you're throwing stones at things, you're prying to see where the problems are, you're testing, you're asking all sorts of questions. So what Socrates would do is he'd always come at the end of one of these speeches that a sophist had made and said, "I'm sorry I've arrived late. I missed the speech. Could you just sum it up for me in a few sentences?" So straight away there's an exercise where you have to get to the core of what it is you meant. And that can be difficult if what you're doing is trying to persuade people. And then he'd say, "Oh, I didn't quite understand what you meant there. Could you explain that again?" "Oh, but I thought that, but didn't that doesn't quite make sense. Forgive me, I'm very simple. I don't understand. You need to break it down more." Of course, this is called Socratic irony. Okay, so the irony is essentially pretending, doing what is not expected. He was pretending not to understand. He was playing dumb, and in this position of being ignorant, he was forcing these sophists, these glamorous, well-paid philosophers, to show their ignorance, in fact, because their whole philosophy was based on manipulation and on a kind of dishonesty. So in ancient Greece, you've got this revolution that is brought about by Socrates. In any case, that's the way that, you know, the history books like to tell it. It's obviously more subtle than that, where he comes along and asks lots of questions and essentially unpicks the game of the sophists. Hence the idea of criticality. Kritikos in Greek means to judge. So he's acting a little bit like a judge, Socrates, in asking these questions and forcing the person in front of him to explain themselves, and ultimately to come up with something that exposes them, and they become judged for their ignorance. Judgment, criticality. But there's a problem with all this. Okay, we're going to get into the limitations of this, and you know, it's veneered in certainly in the Western tradition. Socrates, critical thinking, we associate it with debating, with freedom of speech, with democracy itself, the scientific enterprise of falsificationism. It's called popper. To falsify is to make something really endure the burden of proof, to stand up to scrutiny, to be questioned. We don't just accept things lying down, and it's seen as very good. Not to be gullible, not to be naive, not to just believe whatever you're told. You know, you have to be critical thinking. And so we see it in this very negative sense of attacking, disagreeing, questioning, not taking at face value, not trusting. And it's very much a cornerstone of Western epistemology and, of course, education. But if you think about it, what kind of atmosphere does it create? What kind of social learning does it create? Remember, we're talking about social learning. It's pretty negative, actually. So the idea is, well, you know, I don't believe you. You have to prove what you've said. There's a kind of inquisition going on here. You're also humiliating the person in front of you. You look at a debate, okay, despatere, to fight in Latin. Well, it's actually, yeah, to sort of unfight, if you like, because you're taking away the physical fight and you're putting it in a rhetoric fight, but it's still a fight. There's a winner and a loser in debating. It's one-upmanship. It's this whole kind of atmosphere of destruction. Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who essentially, wrote from the 1850s up until the end of the 1800s. He died young, of course. He couldn't stand Socrates because he thought that Socrates and this train of thought of critical thinking was very passive. He talked about the active principle and the passive principle. So the active principle is creating things, doing things, a work of art, for example, living your life to the full. Whereas the passive principle is standing back and judging, and pointing fingers and saying, oh, that's wrong, and I don't agree with this, and what do you mean? And he thought it just wasn't very fulfilling at an individual or a collective level. It's clever, and you can wind up tripping someone else up and saying, well, that's not true. But what are you building fundamentally? And if you think about the world we're living in today and the future fitness that we need to create within ourselves and our students, we need to be thinking in an entrepreneurial, creative, solution-finding manner, right? We also need to make sure that we're not just sort of drinking up the soup that we're being fed and believing everything, clearly. The point is that critical thinking needs to be thought of, and remember, we're expanding our thinking here, the brick, as much more than this Socratic, narrow, fundamentally negative enterprise. And so a number of authors in critical thinking have sort of moved the needle from Socrates to something else. One of them is Matthew Lipman, who was out of Columbia Teachers College. He invented in the 60s a practice called philosophy for children. We do it at our school, and I strongly encourage you to have a look at it if you don't know it already. First of all, it's with young children, so it's getting them to use some of the language of critical thinking early on. Secondly, that we move away from debating to discussing. It's not like, I'm having a debate with you, and there's going to be a winner and a loser, and it's a competition. And to know we're trying to build up something together. We're actually listening to each other and trying to create some kind of middle ground. It's a very different approach. So, and in philosophy for children, students, they will learn at an early age language that is important for critical discussions. Words like argument, evidence. So good. Yeah, I can see someone in the chat talking about the joys of philosophy for children. So this is it's a less Socratic and more consensus building, communal and caring way of interacting. Lipman always said it's critical and caring thinking. So there's an emphasis on how you listen to the other person, showing respect. You're not in a fight. That's essentially an important point to grasp. We moved to the 1990s, and this couple, they're a couple of academics, but they've done some formidable work in more modern, if you like, approaches to critical thinking. Richard Paul and Linda Elder came up with these constructs, or if you like, dispositions, competences that we can associate with critical thinking. Humility, empathy, integrity, courage, autonomy, perseverance, fair-mindedness, confidence in reason. So you can see we're stretching the definition of critical thinking here from that narrow, convergent, Socratic idea where, I'm just analyzing information in a passive way, to no, I'm actually showing some kind of social responsibility with my critical thinking. I'm caring about other people. I have to use this critical thinking for something good. Integrity, empathy, humility. Critical thinking is much more than detecting errors and shortcomings in other people's discourses. Especially if we're going to move to a more sustainable world, we need to build and not tear down. You take in South Africa, you might have heard of this principle of Ubuntu, which is I am a person because you are a person. It's our common humanity that we share. My humanity is coextensive with the humanity of others. In the Zulu tradition, there's this practice called indaba. The indaba is when there's a problem in the community, we sit in a circle and everybody brings up how they view the problem and also how it's affecting them. And there's a collective approach to find a solution. It's not built on this, much more aggressive, forensic, inquisition-based model where, you're going to open an investigation, you're going to be interviewing people privately, you're going to try and find out who's guilty, there's going to be a disciplinary measure. No, it's more, this is something we have to share as a community, as a circle. So you see, we can think about critical thinking in terms of social learning if we use these more evolved understandings of criticality and put the emphasis on discussion, on listening, on caring, on growing together, on becoming critical thinkers with and through each other. So that's the first part of my talk. It was really just to say, if we're going to take that brick and break it down or expand it or shrink it, we'll find more uses for it. And similarly, let's expand our thought on what the potential and the applications of critical thinking. Now we move to generative artificial intelligence. Everybody's talking about this. It's a bandwagon. There's still sort of panic about it and excitement. It's obviously growing very quickly. And as educators, we have to be looking at it squarely. So what can we say about it? Well, I mean, first of all, what is intelligence? And that we could have a long discussion about that. What is intelligence? You've got different theories of intelligence. You've got general intelligence, which is really designed by psychometricians like Spearman back in the 19th century. You've got triarchic intelligence, which is the idea that it's not just one type of intelligence, but you can have at least three types: creative intelligence, social intelligence, intellectual intelligence. You've also got multiple intelligence theory, Howard Gardner, 11 different types of intelligence. So we've gone from a narrow definition to one where we're covering many different ways of being intelligent. But what runs through all of that is this idea of adaptation, being able to adapt fundamentally. From a biological perspective, a cognitive, social perspective, an intelligent creature adapts to the environment. If you're just sitting there and doing nothing, and there's this world changing around you, and the context is changing, and you're expected to respond, and you can't respond, you're not exercising your human intelligence. So intelligence is something that's fluid, and that's why when you look at algorithmic functionality and this exponential growth of computing power, that there is an adaptation there already. And the fact that it's constantly responding to input and morphing and improving based on that, it's clearly a type of adaptation. So there's this idea that there is an intelligence there. Here's what UNESCO says in their guidance for generative AI in education and research. They say it's generative artificial intelligence automatically generates content in response to prompts written in natural language, in formats that comprise all symbolic representations of human thinking: texts, images, videos, music, software code. It's trained using data collected from web pages, social media conversations, and other online media. And it generates content by statistically analyzing the distributions of words, pixels, elements in that data that it is ingested, and identifying and repeating common patterns. So which words typically follow which other words. So clearly there's some limitation here because we're looking at the probabilistic likelihood of a sequence following another based on large data sets. And we know that, the human mind doesn't really work that way all the time. But for a large part of what we do, we are quite predictable. I mean, you're sort of anticipating, what's going to come in a sentence because of the semantics and the grammatical structure of a sentence. There's a likelihood of certain images or even pixels sort of following another based on the coherence of the whole. Yuval Harari has been speaking about AI ending human civilization. That to me is a bit excessive. I mean, maybe he knows better than the rest of us, but what is human civilization anyway? Exactly. What does that mean? Human civilization. I mean, billions of humans on the planet. I get that. We're not all doing the same thing. Civilization itself is a slightly loaded term as well. But nonetheless, there's some fear about it, of course. There's a lot of fear, rise of the machines and all of that. And then you've got, people like Salman Khan, who sees the positive potential of generative artificial intelligence in education. He's written this book about how, and he focuses on AI tutors and how that's going to revolutionize education. We can really accelerate, augment learning, undercut some of the procedural and fairly low-level task-related human activity, which undergirds education, is actually quite exhausting with machine learning. And that comes around things like assessment, giving feedback based on data input, advice. So again, are we going to look at this in a narrow sense? It's like, oh, this is dangerous and we're worried about it. Or are we going to sort of expand our thinking a little bit and think, okay, but what are some of the things we can do with it? And how can we look at this more positively? If you go back in history, there was a group in the UK around about the time of the Industrial Revolution called the Luddites. And the Luddites were basically terrified of technology, and they thought it was bad. So you can sort of jokingly talk about a Luddite as someone who's anti-tech, who has a discourse against AI, against anything to do with tech, and thinks that we should be, going back in time, living in the woods with no screens. I don't know how feasible that is, really. Which is not to say we shouldn't strike a balance. Okay, you don't have to be wired up to your screens 24/7 and getting all excited about nanotechnology and putting implants in your brain and what have you. But at the same time, especially in a school, sort of trying to shut down technology and saying no, we don't want it. It's a bit problematic. So that we don't want to be Luddites here, I don't think. And we have to understand that things are evolving quickly and changing quickly, that the days of a very sort of simple approach are over. But in fact, Gen AI has been around for a while. There were a lot of early instances of it. And what's happening now is that there are more and more data points. There's a proliferation of AI model computations, and they're feeding off one another, if you like. And so we're building up this exponential growth of computational power. Now, there are some dangerous things that are happening, spoofs that have rattled, for example, the stock market. This goes back a little bit. You might have seen during the LA wildfires images of the Hollywood sign burning. They weren't true. There's more and more stuff online that's fake and has been clearly sort of created. and maybe even done so just automatically. You've got some ethical questions. I mean, international beauty contest judged by artificial intelligence. Well, what do we think of that? And you must have heard of hallucinations where, well, not hallucinations, but hacks, actually. Well, let's not get into hallucinations. The agility with which you can create fake news and actually spoofs is becoming quite worrying, okay? So what are the implications of all this? Essentially, what the point on generative artificial intelligence is that, you know, it's a kind of Pandora's box, and there's so much that it can do. There's so many different directions it could take. What are we focusing on, and where should we put our attention? And how do we exercise creative thinking and divergent thinking on something that is already challenging our basic thought and is evolving extremely quickly? So it's a substantive social and cognitive challenge, but a good challenge to take on board. So I'm going to go back to Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, another great philosopher, who wrote this series of interesting essays on technology, and I would certainly recommend this. I mean, Heidegger's problematic from a number of perspectives. It's also quite difficult to read, but these essays are good. And what he says is this: he says, if you go back to the ancient Greeks again, he was obsessed with the pre-Socratic, so this is even before the sophists. You know, people like Archimedes. Remember Archimedes' screw, where you're actually able to draw water up upstream through this very ingenious method. Euclid and others. He thought that the ancients understood technology and this god of technology, techne, in a very harmonious sense. So it was, how do we take the forces of nature, you know, wind, sun, the waves, and how do we go with that and create new possibilities? Maybe you can redirect the course of a stream, or maybe you can harness the power of the wind. Hence the windmill. The windmill, which is one of the images here for Heidegger, is the symbol of good technology, or of a good use of technology, because it's still natural. It's embedded in a natural organic cycle, but it's using it in a creative way to maybe redirect or use some of the energy that's created. It could be a little bit like a cistern that catches rain and then is then used to irrigate. So this is how technology should be. It should be harmonious. And if you think about the human being and, you know, what makes us human, our passions, everything we know about the human brain and what we need to be healthy, there are uses of technology that are still connected with that way of living. The other extreme, and this is what Heidegger didn't like, and he felt it had really come into play with the Industrial Revolution because it was driven by the economy. It's symbolized by the dam. So the dam, it's stopping a natural flow. So you take a river and you stop it, you build this huge wall, and there's a massive resistance, and it builds up all of this water and creates a huge amount of pressure. And then from time to time, with your sluice gates, you'll let this huge charge of water loose. And the other types of technology and advancement, which are less an enhancement of the natural world and more an imposition on it, they are changing nature. They're interrupting and interfering with things. And so, you know, deforestation, power grids sort of scarring a landscape. You know, obviously massive pollution caused by technology. All of these things are counter-natural, they're unnatural, and they are damaging, and they're sort of pushing a completely different scenario and almost creating a kind of new mutant sort of life that's needed to survive. And of course, you can, if you think about technology that way, including the way we use powerful technology, you can see some of what that might mean. The whole analysis on screen time and the amount of screen time that young people should be having, and saying, well, maybe that's enough. Maybe we need to have some kind of barrier on this, or we need to contain it. It's because if you spend all of your time staring at a screen, unlike looking at a film, which is a projection on a wall, you're staring directly at a light filament, and it damages your eyes fundamentally. And it's also, you take reading, which is a way of processing information slowly and going into detail. If you're scrolling and flitting through information endlessly and jumping from one soundbite to the next, it essentially will enhance a type of attention deficit and hyperactivity. Now, the studies on that are actually quite limited. I even read a study that was showing that a lot of sort of flitting through different sources, because the eye movement is quite impressive. It correlates with quite a lot of thinking. I mean, there are two types of thinking. You've got fluid intelligence, which is, if you like, the way that you are processing information when you're talking, when you are responding to a situation, what we call working memory. And then you've got your long-term memory, which is what you're sort of consolidating and you really know, and you can pull out of your unconscious mind, or the surface of your unconscious mind. So in the former area, which is working intelligence, sort of mental agility, there are actually some studies that show that gaming and sort of moving around different screens, because of the eye movement, which is one of the ways that it's measured and correlated, it's not that bad for working memory. But intuitively, we know that if you spend your time scrolling through the internet, it's not really building up your working intelligence, because you're just getting entertainment. You're just sort of sitting there and there's all this stuff. You're getting overstimulated. It's a little bit like a rat in a cage that's overstimulated. So these are examples of technology that are interrupting human cycles, keeping you up at night, making you addicted. They're not good for you. And you can look at it at a natural scale or at a sort of human individual scale. The point is, technology, again, it's a double-edged sword. And it's for human beings to decide how we're going to use it. Do we want it to be a windmill or a dam? Take Hero's self-leveling bowl. This is back in Alexandria in Egypt. Ancient. It's a brilliant idea. You pull some water out of the serving bowl, or wine, or whatever it is, and that will lower the level of the liquid, which will pull down this floater, and that'll activate a lever that opens up the aperture to the in the reservoir to the tap, and fill up the bowl again. So there's a sort of self-leveling that happens using entirely natural forces. This, for Heidegger, is an example of ingenious, good technology. That's maybe how we want to view generative artificial intelligence. It's important to understand that education has always been accelerated, augmented, and changed through technology. Technology is nothing new. It's as old as the hills. It's basically what it means to be a human being, creating and producing. Think about what the wheel did to communication, the printing press, Morse code. Another thing it's important to understand is that artificial intelligence, it's much more embedded in the Internet of Things and machine learning than we think, and it can happen at quite a simple level. So, this whole idea of a feedback loop is essentially driven by a rudimentary form of artificial intelligence. Your fridge alarm goes off. That's because there's a mechanism in there that, in a way, is thinking. Or your car tells you to fasten your seatbelt. It can detect the sensors in there that detect that your seatbelt's not on. It tells you to do it. You don't think about this as artificial intelligence, but it is. And then, of course, you take geolocation and the use of things like Google Maps to get around. It's satellite positioning, which is very complex. That's a powerful use of technology, which is enhancing and helping us in our life. Unless you want a fridge where it doesn't tell you when you've left the door open, and you don't want to be told to put your safety belt on, and you don't want to know how to get somewhere because you're a Luddite and you say, no, we don't want this. So some of this technology is it seems to really help us, and so we should embrace it. Take research today. I mean, who can seriously tell young people that, you know, the future of research, it's going into libraries and pulling out books and looking manually for sources. It's very quaint, it's very aesthetic, it's very pleasant. And in some areas, you know, I think it might be necessary, but you know, academics today, they're using powerful search engines because they can get much more done, and it's much quicker. You can write quicker. You can, so as difficult as it is, and I'm not saying you shouldn't read or that libraries aren't beautiful things, because they are, and reading, I think, is really essential, especially in early education, for cognitive reasons, for social reasons. But research can be done much better with algorithms, and we shouldn't be sticking our heads in the sand about that. It's a little bit like when you walk into a classroom and you see students, you know, drawing graphs in a subject like maybe geography or maths and coloring them in, and you think, well, that's great, but I mean, when are they going to learn Excel at the end of the day? Because if they get to any kind of serious use of graphs, that you're going to want them to know how to use Excel, how to draw up pivot tables. I mean, that's very basic and it goes back, but not a lot of, you know, not enough work, I think, is being done in that direction. It depends on the school, it depends on the curriculum. I don't want to overgeneralize. So the burning question is not to sort of occult or to overreact to generative artificial intelligence and to think, okay, you know, it's bad wholesale, but rather to think, okay, how can we use this for good? What parts of it are good? What parts of it can help us? What parts of it are actually making life better and easier? That's a more divergent and creative way of looking at it. So that's the second part of the presentation, which is really on similar principle, you know, to critical thinking, the narrow view and the wider view, the sort of the fearful view of artificial intelligence and the more expanded view, where you're embracing it a bit more. I think we have to embrace it, essentially. And I'm not going into the environment because, of course, it burns up a lot of energy, and that is problematic. But that's something we have to take into account when we're using it, so we're using it wisely. It's the same with a lot of what human beings do. We're burning up energy in many of our actions, and you have to kind of factor that in. But you shouldn't have a blanket approach or an oversimplified approach. So what are the recommendations here? This is the last bit. Well, what we say in our generative artificial intelligence policy, and I always say this about technology, is that there are three things it has to be. It has to be ethical, creative, and critical. You have to keep thinking through, okay, is what we're doing with this technology ethical? Is it going to be used creatively and in a way to enhance our thinking? And are we going to be critical about it? Maybe critical in that broad sense. Technology is where our thinking starts. It's not where it stops. It shouldn't be a barrier. It should be an accelerator. So some of the things we've put in our generative artificial intelligence policy is we encourage teachers, educators to use artificial intelligence with students for a whole number of things: to find errors in computer coding or spreadsheet formulas, to generate examination responses, and then ask students to assess the response against examination rubrics. So you can actually get Gen AI to write an exam answer, and then you mark the answer. It can help you with brainstorming real-world examples of concepts and theories that might be quite abstract and counterintuitive. So that's where, you know, there's no point in sort of pushing someone to look for something they can't find beyond a certain point. Why not let them find it and then take it to the next level? You can build up a glossary of examples that can be used to illustrate claims. Generate extended pieces of writing, which can then be critiqued by individuals or groups of students. So we come back to using it as something that can be critiqued. Ultimately, you want students in groups to be looking at generative artificial intelligence created constructs and artifacts and critiquing them, improving them, putting the human touch over them. And you could do that for images as well, to analyze critically images generated with Gen AI and discuss how they could be improved. Of course, there's the whole idea of creating prompts. Some people are going a little bit over the top and saying, oh, the future is about making prompts and that's it. I don't think the future is any one thing. It's about a mindset. But quite clearly, it's like people to say, oh, the language of the future is coding. It's like, really? I mean, that's evolving quickly. No, coding helps, but there are a whole bunch of other things you're going to need to do in the future. There's not one construct that you need. So, but nonetheless, prompt writing is clearly important, because the richer the prompt, the more intelligent the prompt, the more precise the prompt, the better the yield you're going to get. So that's something we have to work on. It's not just how you generate knowledge, but the questions you ask, given that the knowledge can be generated artificially. Coming back to discussion, coming back to ethical, creative, social learning around technology. It's not something that has a beginning or an end. It's really the ongoing endeavor in the human story to seek, to be curious. It's not because we can get information more easily. It's not because answers will come to us that there aren't more questions. The answer creates a question, and the questions will become greater. Our curriculum has to be relevant to the world around us, and the world's evolving fast. So what are we doing about it in our curriculum? What are we assessing? There's a story, just quickly before I end. Hugh Trevor Roper was this incredible academic. He was a professor at Oxford, and he was a specialist on the Second World War. And he published the Hitler Diaries, okay, where he found these supposedly exchanges between Hitler and Goebbels, and they're very kind of detailed. And he published them, and it made quite a buzz in the press. The problem is, we then found out that they weren't true, that in fact the things were plagiarized, and that it wasn't really his fault, but he hadn't detected that they were false, and he should have, because he was the world expert. And why? Because this is an image of exposing that the Hitler diaries weren't true. And when you looked at them carefully, they're pretty ridiculous. Like, just had scrambled eggs with Goering, and why did that happen? And it was probably just a lack of personal discipline in seeking out the details that would have showed him that this was a red herring. So anyone can fall into those traps, whether you've got powerful technology or not. So when we come back to the brick, you can use the brick for many different things, and you need to keep expanding your thinking on critical thinking and generative artificial intelligence. But at the end of the day, there are these simple hallmarks that remain: criticality, creativity, and ethics. They will remain in place forever. As we move to an artificially enhanced way of looking at the world, let's not forget Heidegger's idea of good technology and bad technology. Good technology allows us to incorporate change in natural human cycles, as opposed to bad technology, which is interrupting, interfering, and essentially distorting our humanity. That's my talk. A couple of minutes for questions.
I have the first question for you, if I may. Am I audible? Yeah. All right. So the question is, like, you have this generative AI policy at your school. So how do you go about it? Like, what was the starting point for you? What were the challenges that you came across while you designed your own school policy? And how did you navigate through those challenges?
The first thing is, we did it last year. We're going to have to look at it again because things are changing so fast. But no, we used that UNESCO documentation That was the kind of foundation. And then we used a lot of our experts on the ground. We have technology for learning coordinators. Once we'd drawn up the policy and it had gone through some cycles of review with people in the community who know about the subject and are working in it, we did some training for staff. We actually did open webinars, not only for our staff, but anyone who was interested. And there was a series of them with examples of how people are using it in the classroom. So it's ready to sort of motivate and inspire. And I think any school can do it, and you should do it. At the time when we designed it, we saw through this UNESCO study that a survey early on, it showed that very few schools were doing it. And yet, students are using it, obviously. So you have to kind of grapple with that.
Thank you. So we'll take a few more questions from the audience for a moment. I'm just going to check. Just give me a second. All right, so I think we have another question. So for those school leaders who find it, okay, so how do you think we can use AI to inspire intellectual curiosity and creativity? So I am sure during the course of the session you did speak about it, but if there's a core 3-step thing, what would that be? Like how can...
Yeah, I mean, different people get inspired by different things, but we know enough about the human mind, and you can tell this yourself, that we tend to get inspired by other people. It's difficult to get inspired by a machine or an AI, a bot or an AI tutor. I don't believe that's inspirational. That's kind of giving information. So schools need to remain places where we're inspiring each other in a human way. We have a guest speaker series where there's a lot of storytelling from real life cases, and that's inspiring. However, I think you can certainly drive a lot of curiosity with AI. And I gave some examples. If you have a question and you know that AI can help you find an answer, that actually stimulates more questions, because it puts you in a mindset where you're thinking more. If you're in an environment where you think there are going to be no answers and the answers are limited, you don't know the answers, you're going to ask fewer questions. So I think we should encourage, I've done it with my students in theory of knowledge, in some instance, for them to go and ask AI, whether it's ChatGPT or Gemini or something else you're using. Of course, it's all changing now because of these new Chinese models that are cheaper and are very, very powerful. It doesn't really matter what it is. I think the point is more encourage questioning, because that stimulates the kind of thinking that we want. And if you ask a question, it's to find an answer. Then critiquing the answer can lead to more questions. Don't do it all the time, but just have some environments where say, okay, let's ask AI. Let's see what they say. What do you, maybe one more question? I think you're on mute there.
All right, I'm sorry. So we have a couple of questions. One of them is, what's the key message to school leaders who think either restricting or banning AI in school ecosystems is the best way forward? So what would your message be to those who take that particular approach to AI?
Yeah, I don't think you should ban it. Look, we've got a phone-free environment at our school where students aren't allowed their phones when they get on school, whether it's at break, whether it's at lunch. So I get that, because we don't want them standing around staring at their screens during lunch, during break, before class, after class. It stops conversations, and you don't need to be on your phone that much. We think it sort of interrupts the natural human flow of communication. So that we've done. However, we've got a STEM center, we've got cutting edge technology. We want them to think further and drive their thinking further. So I wouldn't ban it. I would just create an environment, an inspirational environment, to come back to it. And maybe Gen AI is not the area where you're going to get inspired, but things like augmented reality, laser cutting, 3D printing, robotics, where you can, if possible, you can push the thinking there. I don't like the idea of banning it, because what you're basically telling students is we're going to hold you back. We're going to hold you back in a world that's using it to augment thought and find solutions. We're going to stop you from doing that. I mean, why would you want to do that?
Question. What's your vision for AI in education, and what's your prediction for AI in the next 1 decade in education?
I think my prediction, that's a tough one. I mean, I think the only prediction I can come up with is what we saw at COVID, which is that the digital divide is that there's going to be a greater and greater disparity between systems and communities that are using AI to enhance, you know, productivity and those that don't. So it could create these sort of social disparities. And I think that there'll be more and more use of it. Can't predict much further than that. Too difficult. I can predict that there'll be change. That's it.
Thank you. And what's your vision and hope for AI before we wrap up this call?
That we as human beings use it in critical, ethical, creative ways. That we don't just become slaves to the industry of AI, but that we use it intelligently, and that we're not afraid of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Conrad. So we are towards the end. So I understand that we may still have a few questions, and we may not have been able to cover or answer all of your questions through this distinguished global lecture. So your thoughts, ideas, suggestions, and feedback have been valuable to us. So please don't hesitate to share them by emailing us or tagging us on our social media posts. Thank you once again, Conrad, for honoring our invitation to this distinguished global lecture and sharing such insightful knowledge with our audience. To the audience, thank you for taking the time and staying with us today at the 28th edition of the Education Leadership Forum. So we have the education leadership we have the education leaders meetup and workshop on using AI to scaffold social learning with Jason Gulia on March 25th. Join us to learn, share, and contribute to the evolving discourse on AI and social learning. On behalf of the Global Citizenship Foundation, the Council for Global Citizenship Education, and all our attendees, and Horsey AI, the supporter for this forum, I extend our deepest gratitude to Conrad for taking out the time out of his busy schedule and enriching us with his discourse through his unique ideas, insights, and experiences. Also, thank you for being part of the Education Leadership Forum, all of you, and for everything you've been doing to advance this discourse on transforming education for human and planetary flourishing. We really appreciate your time, insights, and effort for everything that you do to drive this extremely crucial discussion on shaping the many futures of education. See you soon. Until then, take care, stay safe, and spread love and compassion. Our world needs it more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing this, and thanks. I'm glad people found it interesting. Have a nice day.